Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. The night settles softly over the silent empires, where whispers travel farther than footsteps. Tonight, we turn our attention to Victor Amuso, a man whose icy resolve and unshakable authority turned fear into his closest ally. His story isn't loud. It moves in silence, in decisions made behind closed doors, and in the shadow of a legacy built on absolute control. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening down in the comments. Your support keeps these quiet legends alive. Now ease back, breathe slow, and let the story of Victor Amuso guide you deeper into the night. On certain nights, long after the lights went out, an older man in a federal prison would lie awake and listen to the sounds around him. Metal doors clanking, guards' boots echoing down a concrete hallway, someone coughing in a bunk nearby. To most people there, he was just another inmate with gray hair, thick glasses, and a quiet voice. But there was a time when his name could freeze a room in New York City. He had once given orders that shaped whole neighborhoods, that decided which businesses opened and which closed, who got paid and who vanished from the streets. Men twice his size had lowered their eyes when he walked in. His signature didn't appear on any official company letterhead, yet money from his moves reached into construction jobs, unions, restaurants, even city contracts. Journalists would later write that, for a stretch of years, he was one of the most feared bosses in America. Now, stretched out on a thin mattress, listening to the hum of a prison at night, he thought about the long avenue that took him from a Brooklyn block to the top of a crime family, and then into this cage. His real name was Victor Amuso, though most people simply called him Vic. His story did not come from movies or television. It grew out of real streets, real choices, and real damage that could never be undone. He had not started at the top. No one in his world did. He came into the world in Brooklyn in 1934, during the Great Depression. The neighborhood where he grew up was a place of narrow sidewalks and crowded tenements, where Italian families packed into small apartments. Fresh bread smells drifted from corner bakeries, kids played stickball in the street, mothers leaned out of windows to shout at them to come up for dinner. It looked, from the outside, like any other working-class neighborhood, full of noise, laughter, and arguments, in a mix of English and old country dialect. Money, though, was always short. Fathers worked in factories, on the docks, in small shops. Some stayed out late doing jobs they never fully explained. Children like Vic learned early that there were two economies running through the same streets. One was visible, with pay envelopes, clock-in times, and bosses who yelled but stayed mostly within the law. The other one moved in whispers, through back doors, card games, favors, and quiet threats. In that second life, there were men who wore good suits even when most of the country was broke. Vic watched them as a boy. He noticed who stepped from shiny cars, who walked into social clubs on the corner, and never seemed rushed. Those places had dark windows, always full of smoke inside, always guarded by men who didn't look big, but carried themselves with absolute confidence. A kid couldn't miss them. Not in that neighborhood. Schools tried to teach history and math, but the sidewalks taught a different lesson. There was fast money out there, if you were willing to take risks and listen to the right people. Nobody can say exactly what moment turned Vic from an ordinary street kid into someone drawn to that underworld. It was not one single day. It was a slow slide, cutting class, hanging on the corners, running errands for older boys who already had one foot in trouble. He learned where numbers bets were written down, where loan payments changed hands, which bars stayed open late for the right customers. On those corners, older guys noticed him. Tough, quiet kids who did not complain were useful. They started giving him small tasks. Carry this envelope. Watch that doorway. Deliver a message. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make the evening papers. Just 1,000 small steps toward a place you could not easily walk away from. By the time he was a teenager, Vic had already been in trouble. Police records from those years would show minor offenses. Small thefts, hanging around known gamblers, being in the wrong place late at night. In that Brooklyn of the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds, Plenty of kids brushed up against the law, and most straightened out with age. The difference with Vic was that he did not pull back. The harder the streets pushed, the more stubborn he became. In that same period, the American Mafia, the so-called families that controlled much of the underworld, were solidifying their grip on the city. The Lucchese family was one of the major ones, centered in part in Brooklyn and the Bronx, with fingers in labor unions, trucking, construction, and illegal gambling. Names like Tommy Lucchese, and later Anthony Tony Ducks, Corallo floated through the social clubs, legendary and distant to a kid like Vic. He would never have imagined he would one day stand at the top of that pyramid. Before any of that, he had to prove himself as an associate. He was not yet a made man, not sworn in, not full-blooded inside the organization. Instead, he was an earner and an enforcer at the lowest rung. He collected from bookmakers who were late on payments. He stood outside dice games to make sure no one caused trouble. He learned how to keep his mouth shut when police asked questions. That last part was vital. Silence, in his world, was not just a survival skill, it was a sacred rule. Those early years shaped the rest of his life. Day by day, Vic watched how the older made men operated. They did not rush. They never raised their voices without a reason. They used charm first, fear second, force only when they felt they had no choice. To outsiders, they looked like friendly uncles, shaking hands outside churches, attending weddings, handing out $20 bills to neighborhood kids. Yet behind that soft front lay a hard system. Debts had to be paid, disrespect had to be answered, and rules were not suggestions. Vic paid attention. In that environment, he found mentors, mid-level figures in the Lucchese family who saw promise in him. They were not movie stars of the underworld, but they controlled crews that brought in real money. They taught him about loan sharking, giving cash to desperate people at sharp interest rates, then collecting relentlessly. They introduced him to the wider network of bookmakers, Shylock borrowers, small business owners who felt they had no better place to turn than the people who scared them. Nothing about this was clean or harmless. Behind every loan sat a family struggling with debt. Behind every number racket sat paychecks drained away. Vic saw that, yet with each job he completed, he also saw his pockets fill. The more he delivered, the more responsibility he got. He was being tested. Could he be trusted with money? Could he be trusted to carry messages between bosses? Could he be trusted when talk turned to enforcement, those quiet words that meant someone was going to get hurt? Details of his earliest violent work would rarely appear in official records, because the whole system thrived on keeping such things cloudy. But people around him knew. A man gained respect in that world not just by earning, but by showing he would never cooperate with law enforcement, no matter the pressure. Vic built that reputation. Arrests did not lead to cooperation. Questioning did not lead to names. Each time he kept quiet, his standing rose. As he reached his 20s, the line between small-time street life and organized crime blurred completely for him. He was no longer simply a local kid doing odd jobs. He moved in and out of social clubs that doubled as headquarters for the Lucchese family. He crossed paths with serious figures, men who had direct access to the family's leadership. Somewhere along that path, the decision to live a normal life slipped away. There were no college plans, no steady factory jobs. The life chose him, as people on the street like to say, but the truth was, he chose it back, again and again. The 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds in New York brought big changes. Highways cut through old neighborhoods. New apartment towers replaced rows of brick houses. Yet the networks Vic relied on only grew stronger. Illegal gambling thrived. Unions became power bases ripe for control. Construction projects needed trucks, cement, and permits, each one a chance for a hidden tax, a payoff, a piece of the action. When someone wanted a contract to go through smoothly, they talked to people connected to men like Vic. He started traveling beyond his childhood blocks, collecting cash from bookmakers in different boroughs, meeting contacts in diners, lounges, back rooms of bars. Each trip widened his world and tightened his ties to the Lucchese organization. By then, he was associated with powerful captains, including men like Christopher Christie Tick Fernari, who commanded deep respect inside the family. Being seen in their company signaled that Vic was not just another street soldier. He was on a path upward. All that upward movement came with shadows. With every dollar taken from a vulnerable borrower, with every rigged game, with every shakedown of a small business, more people felt trapped. Some tried to fight back. Some thought about going to the police. That brought danger. The message in those neighborhoods was simple. If you talked, life got worse. The fear that kept victims quiet was not an accident. It was part of the system. Vic played his role in maintaining that fear, helping enforce silent control over entire blocks. He was not yet the man whose name would later appear in bold headlines. At this stage, he still answered to others. But within the Lucchese family, others started recognizing him as someone reliable, shrewd, and ruthless enough to do what the organization demanded. That combination, loyalty to the family over everything, a willingness to put money and power ahead of law or conscience, is what moved him steadily closer to becoming a fully initiated member. Sometime during these years, Vic took the step that changed his status forever. He was formally inducted as a made man in the Lucchese family. The ceremony itself has been described by those who later cooperated with law enforcement. A quiet oath, a card with a saint's picture, a drop of blood, a promise that the family would come before any government, any other loyalty, even family by blood. Whether every detail was the same in his case, only the men in that room would know, and most are gone now. What matters is that from that moment on, Vic was not just an associate. He was bound by a code that left no space for halfway measures. The weight of that new status fell on him quickly. As a made man, he could now command others. He gained a crew of his own, men who answered first to him and only then to the higher levels of the family. His crew worked in typical rackets of the time. Illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion. When people resisted, pressure increased. Sometimes that meant threats. Sometimes that meant beatings. In extreme cases, it meant planning acts that crossed a line into permanent harm. Street legends later painted him as a cold, distant figure, someone whose calm face never revealed what he was thinking. That cool surface helped him climb further. In meetings, he spoke little but observed a great deal. Arguments swirled around him over territory, splits of money, strategy. He watched who lost their temper, who tried to cheat, who lied. Those mental notes would serve him well in later years, when he reached the point where his word could decide which of those men lived or died. For now, though, he was still rising, not ruling. The 1,970 seconds approached, bringing with them more money than the families had ever seen before. New schemes came into play. Deeper control of unions, bigger construction jobs, larger schemes involving city contracts. The stakes rose, and with them, the risks. Vic, hardened by decades on the street, was ready to move into that harsher, richer era. He had paid for his place with loyalty, silence, and a willingness to do whatever the family needed. The little boy watching men in suits on the corner had become one of them, fully inside that dark economy that had hovered at the edges of his childhood. The real climb, the one that would carry him to the top of the Lucchese family and eventually into a life sentence, was only just beginning. On sweltering summer days in New York, when concrete shimmered with heat and jackhammers rattled every block, men in hard hats thought their supervisors ran the jobs. They saw the foreman barking orders, the union steward checking cards, the city inspector walking around with a clipboard. What they didn't see was the quiet man who could shut a whole site down with a single phone call. Sometimes he'd appear without warning, stepping out of an unremarkable sedan, dressed plainly but neatly. Conversations would stop. Cigarettes would be flicked away. A foreman who had been yelling a minute earlier suddenly grew respectful. The man walked the site slowly, said a few soft words to one or two people, and left. Hours later, problems that had seemed impossible, permits, deliveries, overtime disputes, magically disappeared. Extra cash started changing hands off the books. Everyone knew, without saying it out loud, that the job now moved on his schedule. That man was Victor Amuso. No longer a corner kid but a hardened member of the Lucchese crime family, working his way toward the top. By the late 1,960 seconds, Vic was deep into that life. He had spent years proving himself as a loyal worker for higher-ups, particularly under the guidance of powerful captains. Law enforcement files from that era show his name popping up over and over. In surveillance logs outside social clubs, in the background of investigations into gambling, in whispered mentions from informants who were too afraid to say much more. His world revolved around a few key places, small storefront clubs tucked between grocery stores and barbershops. Inside, blinds stayed half-closed even in the middle of the day. Men played cards for hours, but the real business took place in quiet corners, at tables covered with espresso cups and ashtrays. These were the unofficial headquarters of his crew. One such base eventually became known in law enforcement reports as the 19th Hole, a spot where golf never happened but deals of every kind were made. Over time, Vic developed a close partnership with another rising figure, Anthony Casso, a tough Brooklyn native with a sharper temper and a reputation for explosive reactions. Where Casso pushed hard and fast, Vic stayed more controlled. Together, they formed a dangerous combination, one man quick to strike, the other thinking 3 moves ahead. Working under senior Lucchese leaders, the two built a crew involved in a wide range of criminal activities. Illegal betting remained a steady source of income. Men placed wagers on sports, cards, and numbers games through bookies who sent part of their profits up the ladder. Loan sharking brought in more cash, short-term help to desperate business owners or gamblers, with interest rates that grew like a spreading stain. When payments fell behind, Vic's crew showed up to remind people of their obligations, sometimes in the form of relentless visits, sometimes with threats that needed no explanation. Alongside those operations, the crew stepped into more serious territory. Burglary rings hit jewelry stores and warehouses. Truck hijackings took place on highways and in loading yards, with merchandise quietly redirected and sold on the black market. In all of this, Vic was not just a side player. Associates described him later as a man obsessed with keeping the money flowing upward, making sure a steady stream of envelopes made their way to the family's hierarchy. He knew the rules of his world. The boss and his closest advisors expected tribute. Those envelopes contained the cash that lubricated the entire organization, covering legal fees, helping imprisoned members' families, and lining the pockets of those at the top. A soldier who delivered consistently solid numbers earned trust. A soldier who fell short risked losing more than his position. With success came more sensitive tasks. The Lucchese family, like every major mob organization in that era, protected its rackets through fear. When someone refused to pay, when an associate talked too freely, when a rival crew tried to grab territory, the solution often turned dark. At different times in the late 1960s and 1970s, Vic was linked by later testimony to conspiracies to commit violent acts, including planned killings of people considered threats to the family's interests. Witnesses who eventually cooperated with authorities described him as calm in those moments, rarely raising his voice, discussing life-or-death decisions with a cold practicality. Targets included gamblers who had defied orders, suspected informants, and figures from other crime families who had crossed invisible lines. Law enforcement often suspected his role, but getting evidence that would stand up in court proved extremely difficult. Fear silenced many. Police arrested him more than once during those years. Charges included illegal weapons possession, conspiracy to commit robbery, and other serious crimes. Sometimes he walked free due to lack of witnesses willing to testify. In other cases, prosecutors simply couldn't connect him directly to the actions they knew his crew carried out. Each time he beat a case, his standing inside the organization grew. Survival in court became another mark of status. Behind the scenes, major shifts were taking place at the top of the Lucchese family. Longtime boss Tommy Lucchese died in the late 1960s, and after a period of adjustment, leadership settled into the hands of Anthony "Tony Ducks" Corallo. Corallo held enormous influence not only over his own family but across the wider commission, the body that loosely coordinated the major New York crime groups. Corallo cared deeply about money and stability. He valued people who could earn large sums without drawing unnecessary heat. Vic's rising crew, guided by older captains like Christopher Ferneri, fit that mold perfectly. They focused on profitable rackets that could be disguised behind legitimate businesses: garbage hauling, construction, trucking, and labor unions. The building trades became especially important. In New York, nothing got built without concrete, steel, windows, and inspections. Each step in that chain represented an opportunity for hidden control. The Lucchese family moved aggressively to insert trusted people into key union positions: shop stewards, local presidents, business agents. Through those posts, they could influence which companies won contracts, which crews got overtime, which disputes shut down a job, and which were quietly resolved. Vic learned how to use that leverage. If a developer wanted to avoid costly work stoppages, he often found himself paying more than standard wages, with the extra money vanishing into Mafia books channels. Trucking companies that hauled materials onto city sites were pressured to use certain contractors tied to the family. Cement and drywall suppliers learned that if they played along, their deliveries arrived smoothly. If they resisted, their trucks might sit outside a crowded site for days, losing business while competitors rolled right through the gates. These schemes did damage far beyond the individual victims. Inflated costs were passed on to taxpayers and renters. Legitimate companies that refused to pay extra struggled to survive against favored firms that had unofficial backing. Honest workers watched as decisions affecting their jobs were made in smoky backrooms by men who never carried a union card. For Vic, this was the height of his power as a captain. He oversaw multiple crews that funneled money up to Corallo's inner circle. He still spent time in Brooklyn social clubs, but now he also attended higher-level meetings in more discreet locations. Restaurant back rooms, distant motels, even cars parked in quiet industrial areas. In those discussions, he was no longer just a listener. His voice carried weight. Along the way, his partnership with Anthony Casso grew more entrenched. The two coordinated on extortion rackets, union manipulation, and high-stakes gambling operations. They also worked together when the family decided someone needed to be removed. Later, courtroom testimony from former insiders placed both men near the center of multiple murder conspiracies in the 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds, though they often insulated themselves through layers of intermediaries. Orders flowed down the chain. The men who carried them out rarely saw the full picture. Inside the Lucchese organization, fear of being seen as disloyal was constant. Rumors that someone might talk to law enforcement could prove fatal. Periodically, people disappeared or were found dead under suspicious circumstances. Their names eventually surfaced in federal indictments and racketeering cases as victims of underworld slayings tied to Lucchese power struggles. Investigators came to believe that Vic, acting either on his own initiative or under direction from above, had approved or helped plan several of these acts. The climate beyond the underworld was changing as well. In the 1970 seconds, federal authorities began using new tools, wiretaps, hidden microphones, and broad racketeering laws to go after entire criminal organizations rather than just individual incidents. The FBI and U.S. attorneys focused on the commission and the five families as interconnected enterprises. Bugs appeared in social clubs, cars, and even upstairs apartments above meeting spots. Tony Corallo, ever cautious, sometimes held important conversations while being driven around the city, believing that moving vehicles were safer than bugged rooms. He did not realize that even his car would eventually become compromised. For men like Vic, this meant the old assumption of privacy was slowly melting away, even though they didn't yet know exactly how exposed they were. Still, on the surface, business looked strong. The Lucchese family's control of certain unions and construction niches brought in millions. Gambling remained a river of cash. Loan sharking thrived, especially in neighborhoods where banks refused credit to working-class people, leaving them vulnerable to the lure of quick money with brutal terms. Extortion payments from small businesses, bars, restaurants, nightclubs added to the flow. Those who resisted often discovered that their deliveries were delayed, their windows mysteriously cracked, their customers harassed. The underlying message never needed to be spoken plainly. Pay, or life gets harder. For owners with families to support, the cost of refusal seemed too high. Many handed over envelopes each week, hating it but feeling helpless. In this environment, Vic cultivated both fear and loyalty. To his crew, he could appear generous, helping pay legal fees, sending money to imprisoned associates' families, delivering cash envelopes at holidays. To outsiders, he was a quiet threat, the man behind the curtain. He rarely appeared in public arguments, preferring to let others raise their voices. But everyone locally knew who truly decided outcomes. By the early 1980 seconds, his rise had carried him into the family's upper layers. Older leaders like Corallo leaned on him and Casso for enforcement and for handling sensitive disputes. When another family edged too close to Lucchese rackets, or when an internal disagreement turned dangerous, the two Brooklyn partners often sat at the planning table. Even then, though, Storm clouds were gathering. Federal investigators had been listening more than anyone suspected. Evidence was piling up in secret indictments that would soon shake the mafia structure in New York to its core. Bugs planted in cars and clubs recorded conversations about labor rackets, kickbacks, and violent acts. Names were spoken out loud that had long remained only street whispers. Vic continued running his operations as if the system would last forever. He walked onto construction sites, nodded to union handlers, and sat in social clubs sipping espresso, unaware that microphones hidden in ceilings and dashboards were catching enough to send men like him away for the rest of their lives. Soon, the long-running reign of Tony Corallo would be shattered by sweeping federal cases targeting the entire commission. In the vacuum that followed, the Lucchese family would look for a new leader, someone feared, connected, and proven over decades in the underworld. The quiet captain from Brooklyn, who had spent a lifetime turning whispered threats into real control over a city's work and wages, was about to be pushed into a position that would magnify both his power and his eventual downfall. Mid-1000, 980 seconds, New York liked to see itself in glossy magazine covers, skyscrapers glowing at night, Wall Street booming, limousines lined up outside trendy restaurants. But beneath that shine, something else was happening. Investigators had quietly planted listening devices in places where mob leaders felt safest. Cars that once seemed like rolling fortresses now carried hidden microphones. Social clubs, long considered secure, turned out to have tiny wires tucked behind walls or above ceiling tiles. In one of those bugged cars, federal agents listened as Tony Corallo, the longtime Lucchese boss, spoke freely about unions, construction, and other families. Those tapes, patiently collected during endless drives around the city, became the backbone of a historic case that would later be known simply as the Commission Trial. For the first time, prosecutors set out to prove that the five families formed an organized board of directors for American organized crime. When indictments dropped in 1985, they slammed into the underworld like a wrecking ball. Corallo, his consigliere Christopher Fernari, and other top Lucchese figures were arrested and charged under racketeering laws. The trial that followed laid bare years of schemes: construction bid rigging, labor rackets, extortion. In 1986, guilty verdicts landed. Soon after, heavy sentences followed, hundreds of years combined, effectively removing a generation of leadership from the streets. Inside the Lucchese family, a vacuum opened at the top. The old guard was gone, locked away in high-security prisons. Somebody had to take their place. Money still flowed through illegal betting, unions still needed steering, loans had to be enforced, and the construction rackets couldn't run themselves. The organization looked for someone with proven loyalty, a strong earning record, and the resolve to keep discipline in a dangerous new era. Eyes turned toward the quiet, controlled captain from Brooklyn, Victor Amuso. By then, Vic had decades of service behind him. He had survived arrests and investigations without talking. He had run profitable crews, particularly in the construction and union arenas. He knew every major figure in the family and had worked closely with both Fernari and other high-ranking captains. Most importantly, he already had a powerful ally in Anthony Cosa, who had become one of the most feared men in the organization. At some point between the mid-1000, 980 seconds commission case and the late part of that decade, Vic emerged as the new official boss of the Lucchese family. Exact dates and details vary in different accounts, because such decisions were made in secret meetings and confirmed through whispers rather than written contracts. What is clear is that by the latter half of the 1,980 seconds, law enforcement, informants, and insiders recognized him as the man at the top. Cosa became his underboss, his principal enforcer and strategist. The partnership was dangerous. Vic brought cold patience and a talent for organization. Cosa brought unrestrained aggression and a willingness to use violence as the first tool, not the last. Together, they reshaped the family into a harsher, more suspicious outfit than it had been under Corallo, whose focus had leaned more on quiet profit than internal terror. Once in power, Vic pushed to tighten control over every major money stream tied to the family. Construction rackets remained central. New York's building boom had not slowed. Office towers, housing projects, and commercial complexes rose all over the city. Behind many of those projects sat a web of manipulation involving several crime families, who carved up contracts among themselves, ensuring that only approved suppliers and contractors landed the biggest deals. One infamous example later exposed in court involved window installation on city-owned housing. Multiple families, including the Lucchese group, were accused of secretly steering these contracts. Companies agreed ahead of time who would win particular bids. Prices were artificially pushed upward, with the difference skimmed off. Legitimate firms that tried to compete honestly found themselves frozen out or pressured into paying tribute. For someone in Vic's position, these schemes generated enormous sums without much need for visible street-level activity. His crew also pressed harder on labor unions. Business agents and local officers who had long accepted cash quietly now dealt with a leadership that demanded stricter obedience. If a particular local tried to shake off outside influence, pressure increased. Union elections were nudged one way or another. Organizers who spoke of cleaning up corruption felt subtle pushback. Threats to their jobs, harassment, threats that reached into their family lives. All of it sent a message that resistance carried a cost. Within the family itself, Vic's rule quickly became associated with fear. The new boss came to believe that survival required eliminating not just enemies from outside, but anyone inside who might one day turn against him. He and Cosa maintained lists of people they considered unreliable, disloyal, or simply too independent. When suspicion surfaced that someone had cooperated with authorities or defied orders, the response was often lethal. Former Lucchese members who agreed years later to testify for the government described this period as one of constant tension. Men who had served the organization for decades started to look over their shoulders. A careless remark, an unexplained absence, or simply being tied to the wrong faction could draw unwanted attention. Once a name appeared on the boss's mental blacklist, escape often meant choosing between federal protection or risking a violent end. One major source of conflict involved the Lucchese operations in New Jersey. For years, under Corallo, a veteran mobster named Anthony Tumac Axaturo had led the Jersey wing. His crew controlled gambling, loan sharking, and other rackets across that state, sending a steady share of profits back to New York. Under the old arrangement, Axaturo had enjoyed a degree of independence, setting his own strategies while staying loyal to the family. Vic and Cosa saw this structure as a problem. They wanted tighter central control and a larger share of the Jersey profits. They began summoning Axaturo and his people to meetings, pressing for higher payments and more direct oversight. Tensions grew. The Jersey operators felt they had already proven their value and resented sudden demands from leaders who had not grown up in their territory. In 1988, a gathering in Florida brought these tensions into focus. Accounts from participants later surfaced in courtroom testimony. Vic and Cosa confronted the Jersey faction about money, complaining that tribute had not matched expectations. Voices rose. Threats, veiled or open, hung in the air. The meeting ended without a clear resolution, but everyone left knowing that the relationship had fractured. As time went on and defiance continued, Vic's frustration hardened into fury. He came to believe that the Jersey group no longer respected his authority and might someday break away entirely or even cooperate with law enforcement. In response, he took one of the most extreme steps of his reign. He privately issued an order to have virtually the entire Jersey crew eliminated. That directive, repeated later by multiple witnesses, shocked even hardened mob insiders. Killing a rival from another family or a suspected informant was one thing. Targeting an entire wing of one's own organization showed a new level of paranoia and brutality. It revealed how far Vic was willing to go to secure full control. Carrying out such a sweeping order proved complicated. Some Jersey members fled, sensing danger. Others quietly opened discussions with prosecutors, entering witness protection rather than risk being hunted by their former partners. A few lost their lives in suspicious incidents linked by investigators to this internal purge. Over time, the once strong New Jersey operation crumbled, fractured by fear and law enforcement pressure. What had been a lucrative branch of the organization in earlier decades became a source of cases that harmed the entire family. These events did not happen in isolation. Across New York, federal agents were tracking the Lucchese group more aggressively than ever. New laws made it easier to treat the family as a criminal enterprise. Each act of extortion or planned killing added to larger racketeering cases. Every frightened associate who decided to cooperate brought fresh details to prosecutors. Patterns emerged, where meetings occurred, who passed messages, How money flowed up to Vic and Casso. A particularly dark chapter during this period involved corrupt law enforcement officers. Anthony Casso, eager to stay ahead of investigations and locate targets, began paying 2 New York detectives who secretly worked for him while wearing official badges. In exchange for cash, they provided confidential information from police files, tips about surveillance, details on arrests, help in tracking people marked by the Lucchese leadership. Their betrayal of their oath later shocked the city when it came to light. From his position as boss, Vic benefited from this stream of intelligence. While Casso handled the direct contact with the detectives, the information filtered upward. It allowed the family to dodge some investigations, locate people they saw as threats, and stay one step ahead of honest officers who were trying to dismantle the organization. Each time a witness was frightened into silence, or a planned arrest fizzled because someone had been tipped off, faith in the justice system took a hit. Despite these advantages, the noose was tightening. By the late 1982, prosecutors had amassed years of recordings, financial records, and testimony from insiders who had lost faith in the code of silence. They linked Vic to a broad range of crimes: union corruption, bid rigging, illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and a chain of murders carried out to maintain control and silence opposition. In 1990, after long preparation, federal authorities unsealed a sweeping indictment against him and numerous Lucchese associates. It outlined a pattern of criminal activity stretching back years, painting a picture of a boss who had turned fear into policy. The charges included racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, and participation in multiple killings, either through direct orders or approval, as head of the family. When agents moved in to arrest him, however, they found that word had already reached their target. Someone had tipped him off, likely through the same network of corrupted insiders that had shielded the family in earlier operations. By the time arrest teams arrived, Vic was gone. For more than a year, he lived as a fugitive. He slipped out of New York, relying on safe houses arranged by loyal supporters. He moved between different states, rarely staying long in one place. Under assumed names, he rented apartments, checked into motels, and used payphones instead of regular lines. Cash, not checks. Paid for nearly everything. Associates visited under strict instructions. No direct calls, no obvious tales, short meetings only. From hiding, he tried to continue guiding the family. Messages traveled through trusted intermediaries, sometimes passing through several hands before reaching their final destination. Orders about money collections, disputes, and even life or death decisions still traced back to him, though the distance made everything more unstable. Casso, still free at that stage, took on even more day-one-a-day power, further deepening the climate of fear. Living on the run took a toll, always watching doors, always scanning crowds, never fully able to relax. Most fugitives eventually slip, not necessarily through grand mistakes but small habits: a familiar restaurant, a pattern of travel, a friend who draws attention. In Vic's case, investigators began tracking someone close to him, a woman tied to his life away from the public eye. Surveillance teams followed her carefully, noting her routines, the places she visited, the faces that appeared around her repeatedly. Slowly, a pattern emerged that led them to a quiet city far from Brooklyn, Scranton, Pennsylvania. On a summer day in 1991, federal agents closed in on a modest shopping area in that town, according to later reports. They had reason to believe their long-sought target was inside a local beauty salon, trying to maintain an appearance that no longer matched his reality. Plainclothes officers positioned themselves outside. Others moved in through the entrance, pretending to be ordinary customers before revealing badges. Inside, they found the man who had once controlled millions and ruled one of New York's most notorious crime families. He did not go out in a blaze of glory. There was no shootout, no dramatic chase. Cornered in a small business far from the neighborhoods where his name had inspired fear, he surrendered without a fight. Agents led him out in handcuffs, past shoppers who had no idea they were witnessing the end of a long manhunt. For the first time since his rise to boss, Vic faced the full weight of the federal system with nowhere left to run. Behind him lay years of silent control over unions, construction, gambling, and lives shattered by extortion and violence. Ahead waited courtrooms, witnesses ready to speak, and the possibility of never walking free again. The ride back to New York, started with the sound of a cell door slamming shut inside a small federal holding area in Scranton. Hours earlier, Vic had walked into that beauty salon as a man on the run, still technically the boss of the Lucchese family. Now he sat in the back of a government car, wrists cuffed, flanked by armed agents who spoke to each other more than to him. Out the window, Pennsylvania's hills slid by. Gas stations, strip malls, highway exits, they all looked like a different country from the Brooklyn blocks where he'd learned his first lessons about power. The agents had his photograph clipped to a folder, the black and white mugshot staring up with a blank expression he had spent decades perfecting. He knew the routine. This was not his first arrest, but it was the first time the charges reached all the way up to his role as boss. The indictment he now faced was not about a single bet or one extortion. It described an entire life's work as part of a criminal organization. Racketeering, illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, labor corruption, and a list of killings that prosecutors said he had ordered or approved. When they brought him into Manhattan, cameras waited outside the courthouse. Reporters shouted questions as agents guided him past them. He kept his eyes forward. Flashbulbs popped. For years, his name had been whispered in bars, union halls, and social clubs. Now it appeared in headlines as alleged kingpin, reputed boss, accused architect of underworld violence. Inside the federal building, the routine took over. Fingerprints pressed onto ink pads and cards. Personal property sealed in clear bags. A medical check? Quick questions? A new number assigned. Eventually, he was led to a cell in the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a high-rise jail blocks from the courthouses, where his future would be decided. From that point on, his world shrank to concrete, steel, and institutional light. Yet even in custody, he tried to project the same calm he had shown in street meetings. When his lawyer came to see him through thick glass, Vic listened carefully as the charges were read out again in more detail. The government had not come lightly. They accused him of running a criminal enterprise under the racketeering laws, using the Lucchese family to control unions, construction companies, and illegal betting operations. They tied him to bid-rigging schemes in the huge window contracts for public housing. They said he had approved or ordered numerous killings to maintain discipline, remove suspected informants, and impose his will during internal disputes. The lawyer explained that some of the evidence didn't come from old-fashioned surveillance. It came from people who had once sat across from him at card tables and dinner meetings, former associates and captains now agreeing to testify in exchange for protection and reduced sentences. Vic listened without obvious reaction. Betrayal was not a surprise in his line of work. He had always known that the threat of long prison terms might crack even hardened men. Still, hearing that individuals he'd trusted for years were now preparing to face him across a courtroom cut deep, even if he never showed it. While he sat in the MCC, the outside world didn't stop. His underboss, Anthony Cosa, remained on the street, still a fugitive. From hiding, Cosa tried to keep the family's operations running and also worked to protect himself, sometimes in ways that only increased the trouble. Inside the Lucchese organization, temporary leaders were installed to manage day-to-day affairs. Before Vic's arrest, he had already relied on Alphonse Little Al Darko to act as a street boss. Darko knew the structure, the faces, the income streams. He had attended secret meetings, helped settle disputes, and overseen collections. When Vic fled New York to avoid the first wave of indictments, Darko was one of the men trusted to keep the machinery turning. Now Darko found himself squeezed from both sides. On one side stood federal agents carrying wiretap transcripts, photographs, stacks of documents, and the promise of long sentences. On the other side loomed the fear that Vic and Cosa might decide he knew too much, or suspected that his loyalty had weakened, and mark him for removal. Stories of the Jersey crew and other internal purges were fresh in his mind. In September 1991, while Vic sat in pre-trial custody, Darko reached his own breaking point. He had believed for years in the code of silence, the unwritten rules of loyalty. But when he saw signs that he himself might be targeted, he made a decision he never imagined he would make. He quietly approached federal authorities and agreed to cooperate. That move shattered a barrier that had held for decades. Darko became the first man who had effectively served as a boss of a New York crime family to take the witness stand for the government. He brought with him detailed knowledge of how the Lucchese hierarchy operated, who gave orders, how money flowed, where meetings were held, and how decisions about life and death were made. For prosecutors preparing to try Vic, Darko's cooperation was a windfall. He walked them through the family structure, naming captains, soldiers, and important associates. He explained the background of the conflict with the New Jersey wing, described how window contracts were rigged, and outlined the way the leadership handled suspected disloyalty. He was not the only one who flipped. Members of the Jersey faction, already shaken by the earlier death orders directed against them, gave their own accounts. Another crucial witness was Peter Chiodo, a powerful Lucchese captain and key figure in construction rackets. After surviving an attempt on his life, he chose to testify rather than live in constant fear. He told prosecutors about killings plotted at the highest levels, about envelopes stuffed with payoffs, and about pressure placed on union officials and contractors. Piece by piece, the government built a picture of Vic not just as a participant in criminal activity, but as the director of a wide-reaching network that used intimidation and lethal force as tools of business. They emphasized that under the racketeering laws, a boss could be held responsible for crimes he ordered or approved, even if he was not physically present when they occurred. In pre-trial hearings, defense lawyers tried to push back. Witnesses, they argued, were criminals trying to save themselves by pointing fingers upward. They reminded the court that many of these men had lied before and only chose to speak when they were facing decades behind bars. They tried to cast doubt on the entire government picture, suggesting exaggeration and self-serving stories. Vic held firm publicly. He entered pleas of not guilty, insisting through his attorneys that the government was stitching together a case from unreliable sources. He did not speak much in court beyond the required statements. But when he did, his voice remained even, his expression controlled. To those who had known him on the street, it was the same mask he had worn in social clubs and construction site entourages. Bail was never a serious possibility. The scale of the charges, his history of flight, and the government's view of him as a danger to the community made release unthinkable. So he spent his days in a small cell, preparing for trial, using meetings with his lawyers to hear the details of the mountain of evidence. Despite his confinement, he tried to keep some hold on the family's direction. Prison did not end his influence overnight. Messages could still travel, pass through coded conversations with visitors or through lawyers who, knowingly or not, carried hints and instructions back to the outside world. Fellow inmates, some with their own ties to organized crime, recognized who he was and treated him with deference. But the organization on the street was changing under pressure. Each new cooperator shook foundations further. What had once been a tight circle of silent men now showed cracks all over. Fear of both the government and the leadership's harsh internal policies drove more people to talk. The same climate of terror that Vic and Cosa had created to enforce obedience now began to work against them, convincing some that their only safety lay in a witness stand and a new identity. In 1992, the trial began in a Brooklyn federal courtroom. Security was tight. Marshals guarded the entrances. Inside, jurors took their seats not just for a single incident, but for a sweeping story of a criminal enterprise that prosecutors said stretched across decades. They presented ledgers showing illegal gambling profits, bank records tied to hidden ownership of companies, and recordings where coded comments hinted at violent plans or pressure on contractors. Then came the witnesses. Darko took the stand and identified Vic in the courtroom. He told jurors about leadership meetings where policy decisions were made, which unions to target, which companies to favor in bids, how to punish people who failed to send enough money up the chain. He described a boss who expected obedience and who responded to suspected betrayal with lethal measures. Chiodo followed with his own testimony, focusing on construction and union schemes. He explained how the family took a secret cut of contracts, how strikes could be started or stopped by a phone call, how non-cooperative companies suddenly found trucks blocked, workers walking off jobs, or permits delayed. He spoke about ambushes ordered against people seen as dangerous to the organization, without lingering on the physical details, but making clear that these decisions came from the very top. Members of the New Jersey crew added their voices, describing the moment they learned that a death order had been given for nearly their entire faction. They talked about frantic meetings, fears for their families, and the eventual decision by some to seek government protection. For jurors, it was a rare window into how quickly loyalty inside a criminal group can flip once members decide they are being treated as expendable. Through it all, Vic sat at the defense table in a suit and tie, listening as one former ally after another spoke his name in connection with murders, conspiracies, and extortion plots. Occasionally, he leaned over to whisper to his lawyer, passing notes or clarifying some point. But to the public in the gallery, he appeared steady, even when hearing accounts of meetings that had once been private moments of power. The defense cross-examined every witness hard. They pointed out inconsistencies in memories, deals struck with prosecutors, and the personal motives each man had for shifting blame upward. They tried to present their client as a convenient target for men who had already admitted their own roles in serious crimes. Yet the combined weight of the testimony, documents, and context formed a heavy load. Most jurors had never been inside a social club in Brooklyn, never attended a union meeting where decisions were quietly prearranged, never seen an envelope of cash change hands in a back room. Over weeks of testimony, they were guided through that world step by step, shown how unspectacular storefronts and modest meeting halls could hide deep systems of control. Prosecutors emphasized that the case was not about a glamorous underworld, but about ordinary people harmed by hidden corruption, small business owners pressured to pay for protection, workers whose union leadership was secretly compromised, taxpayers whose bills rose because contracts were fixed, and families who lost relatives in underworld disputes they never fully understood. As the trial neared its end, both sides made closing arguments. The government asked jurors to see a pattern, a man who had spent his adult life rising through a criminal organization, using intimidation and lethal decisions as standard tools of management. The defense urged them to see doubt-flawed witnesses, old crimes dredged up and pinned on the one man who had refused to make a deal. The jury deliberated over days, carefully reviewing notes and asking the judge for clarifications on complex racketeering rules. When they returned, the verdicts came one after another. Vic was found guilty on a long list of counts: racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, illegal gambling, and responsibility for multiple killings as part of the organization's operations. The jurors accepted the government's argument that as boss, he had overseen and approved a pattern of criminal conduct that reached from Brooklyn to New Jersey and deep into the heart of New York's construction and labor world. Sentencing followed. In another crowded courtroom, the judge read out the punishment: life in prison, without the possibility of parole, plus additional years on top of that sentences, stacked in a way that made clear he would never legally walk free again. The judge criticized the damage done by organized crime, the fear spread through neighborhoods, the hidden taxes imposed on honest businesses, the undermining of unions meant to protect workers, and the ruthless elimination of anyone seen as a threat. Vic listened, his hands folded in front of him. He declined to admit guilt. Years of living by a code that rejected cooperation with authorities did not disappear now. He left the courtroom under guard, heading not back to a local jail to await another trial, but into the long pipeline that leads federal inmates from city holding facilities to distant high-security prisons. Outside, reporters once again gathered. They filmed the vans leaving, spoke about the end of a chapter in New York's underworld history, and repeated the judge's words. For the public, it was the conclusion of one story: a feared boss brought down by the testimony of his own men and the increasing reach of federal racketeering laws. Inside the Lucchese family, it did not feel like an ending. Their boss was now permanently behind bars, yet he still lived, still thought, still had a name that commanded respect or fear among those who remained loyal. The next phase of his life and of the organization he had led would unfold not on city streets, but from behind prison walls, through coded messages, shifting alliances, and a slow, dawning realization that the world outside was changing in ways the old codes had never prepared them for. The bus that carried him out of New York wasn't marked with his name, only a number on a metal plate and the letters of a federal agency painted on the side. Inside, chains rattled as rows of prisoners shifted on steel benches. Some talked in low voices, some stared forward, some slept with their heads against glass. Vic sat among them in a khaki uniform, wrists and ankles cuffed, a chain at his waist. The courtroom noise, the judge's voice, the cameras outside the building, those were behind him now. Ahead waited something different. A lifetime measured in counts, lockdowns, and slow days in a high-security penitentiary. He arrived at a fortress of concrete, razor wire, and guard towers, far from the city where he had spent nearly all of his life. Intake staff took another set of fingerprints, another photo, issued him an inmate number, and explained the rules. No private meetings, no business dealings, mail screened, calls monitored. For someone who had once run a crime family, the message was clear. The government wanted him contained not only physically, but also in influence. Yet prison, especially at the federal level, had long been part of the mafia world. Many bosses before him had done time and continued to exert control from behind bars. The system had procedures, so did his circle. He was placed in a high-security unit. The routine settled in quickly. Wake up, count, chow hall, work assignment, or recreation. Count again. Doors clanged open and shut on a schedule set by others. Guards called him by a number, not by name. At night, light from the hallway slipped under the door, a thin strip that never quite allowed full darkness. Even so, he did not vanish from the organization he had led. Through visits, letters, and carefully worded phone calls, he stayed in touch with trusted people on the outside. Experienced inmates knew how messages could travel. Through relatives, lawyers, even seemingly ordinary correspondence that, to someone who understood the code, carried instructions. On the street, there was no question that he remained the formal boss. Others stepped in to handle daily operations, but they did so with the understanding that important decisions still required his approval. Investigators would later testify that they intercepted notes and conversations showing that, from his cell, he was still demoting and promoting, still weighing who should oversee certain crews or territories. While he adjusted to life behind bars, his longtime partner in power, Anthony Casso, continued life as a fugitive. Casso moved from one hidden location to another, using safe houses and aliases. Eventually, in early 1993, federal agents tracked him down in a house in New Jersey. When they burst in, they found one of the most feared men in the underworld cornered in a suburban setting, far from the Brooklyn streets where his reputation had been built. Casso's capture added a new dimension to the pressure on the Lucchese family. Faced with the same kind of evidence and potential sentences that had just brought Vic a life term, he made a choice his partner did not. He agreed to cooperate. From his cell in federal custody, Casso began telling investigators about years of criminal activity. He gave details on dozens of killings tied to Lucchese operations, including attacks on suspected informants, members of rival families, and people caught in internal disputes. He explained how he had used 2 New York detectives as secret sources, paying them to reveal confidential law enforcement information and to help identify and locate targets. Those revelations eventually helped build the famous Mafia Cops case years later. Prosecutors, at least at first, saw Casso as a potentially powerful witness. He knew a great deal about the inner workings of multiple crime families, and his testimony threatened to draw even more associates into indictments. But his cooperation turned out to be chaotic. Reports later emerged that he continued to mislead investigators and conceal new crimes, even while claiming to help, undermining his value. Eventually, the government dropped him as a formal witness, and he too received a life sentence. Still, the damage from his information had been done. Names that had once been tightly guarded appeared in case files. Old murders that had gone unsolved for years gained timelines and motives. For Vic, facing his own long stretch, the realization that his former underboss had turned into a major source for the government reinforced something he already knew. The old code was cracking under the weight of modern prosecutions and long prison terms. In 1994, the legal pressure on him deepened. While serving the life sentence handed down after his trial, he faced an additional federal case that covered a wide array of crimes linked to his years leading the family. Rather than go through another long public trial with the same witnesses and evidence, he entered a guilty plea to a sweeping set of racketeering counts. Those charges included responsibility under the law for a series of killings and attempted killings carried out by the organization during his leadership, as well as conspiracies involving extortion, loan sharking, and labor corruption. The new conviction added another life sentence on top of the one he already had. Legally speaking, he was now buried under enough time that release was no longer a serious topic. The question was not whether he would die in prison, but where and under what conditions. Meanwhile, back on the street, the Lucchese family struggled to adapt. With both the boss and the underboss locked away, And with former high-ranking figures like Alphonse Darco and Peter Chiodo cooperating, the old hierarchy lay in ruins. Yet criminal economies did not simply vanish. Illegal betting still had customers. Shylock loans still brought in profit. Certain unions and construction niches were still vulnerable to manipulation. From his cell, Vic made clear that he expected the family to continue, not dissolve. He used visits and letters to signal who should take the helm in his absence. One of the men elevated during this period was Joseph Little Joe DeFede, a veteran figure who had spent years in the organization. DeFede became the acting boss responsible for managing day-with-day activities, while another rising figure, Stephen Wonderboy Crea, took charge of powerful rackets in the Bronx and surrounding areas, particularly involving construction and labor. Under this new arrangement, the family tried to rebuild its finances in the mid-1990s. They leaned heavily on old strengths: gambling, loan sharking, protection payments from bars and restaurants. But they also pursued newer schemes. Investigators later tied Lucchese associates to scams involving phone cards, stock market manipulations, and medical billing fraud. The basic pattern remained the same: find a system, pressure or infiltrate it, and siphon money. One major focus remained the construction industry. Even after the high-profile Windows prosecutions of the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was still room for influence in how contracts were awarded, how labor disputes were handled, and which companies got jobs in certain areas. Crea, with deep roots in building trades and unions, became known in law enforcement circles as a key figure in these efforts. He and his associates were suspected of steering projects, collecting taxes from contractors, and interfering in union elections to place friendly faces in key roles. Each step they took brought fresh law enforcement attention. Federal agents no longer viewed the mafia as a fading force to be handled through small cases. They saw long-running enterprises that required large, patient investigations. Wiretaps went up on phones. Undercover agents infiltrated certain businesses. Court-authorized bugs found their way into meeting spots once believed safe. Inside prison, Vic heard pieces of this through visits and legal meetings. He stayed loyal to his long-time refusal to cooperate with the government. He would not sit in a witness chair or sign a statement for prosecutors. Whatever criticisms he might have had of people who had flipped, he kept them within his own circle. Outwardly, he maintained the same stance he had held for decades. The justice system was the enemy, not a partner. Federal documents and later testimony show that he still used what influence he had to shape the leadership. When word reached him that certain figures were suspected of holding back money or not sending enough tribute from particular rackets, he reacted sharply. In the old days, on the street, such anger might have translated quickly into direct action. Behind bars, he had to rely on words carried by others' letters, messages through visitors, calls that sometimes spoke in half-sentences and references only insiders could decode. That distance did not necessarily make things safer. Around the late 1990s, whispers about skimming reached him concerning DeFede. Reports vary on exactly how much he believed, but the message that came back from prison was harsh. DeFede was removed from his role, and there were signs that worse might follow. The acting boss, sensing that he might be the next internal target in a long line of punished men, made a decision familiar by then in New York's underworld. In 2000, Joseph DeFede became another higher-ranking Lucchese figure to cooperate with federal authorities. He recounted how money moved from gambling and extortion into the family's pocket, described his own role in different schemes, and spoke about the continuing authority of the imprisoned boss. His testimony, combined with information from other insiders, helped build a major case against Crea and several associates. That case, brought at the start of the new century, focused heavily on labor corruption and extortion tied to unions and construction. Prosecutors alleged that the Lucchese group had shaken down contractors, demanded payoffs to ensure labor peace, and muscled in on joint ventures. Wiretap recordings played in court captured fragments of coded talk, references to friendship, help, and taking care of things, which investigators said were euphemisms for illegal demands and pressure. Crea and others fought the charges in court. Some were convicted and received lengthy sentences. Others were acquitted of certain counts. But the process itself damaged the organization, pulling more of its experienced figures into prison and exposing years of hidden dealings. By the end of the 990 seconds, and start of the 2000s, the once-feared Lucchese family looked very different from the force that had dominated construction and union rackets in earlier decades. Whole branches had been gutted by indictments and cooperation. Former loyalists now lived under new names in distant parts of the country, placed in protection programs because they had agreed to testify. Others were scattered among prisons from one end of the United States to the other. Through all of this, Vic remained where the court had sent him, locked in a high-security federal facility, aging behind walls. Fellow inmates recognized him, especially those with their own links to organized crime. Accounts from people who later spoke about doing time near him describe a reserved man who kept his routine, spent time walking the yard or reading, and did not advertise his past to younger prisoners who only knew of the mob through movies. His physical power diminished with age, but within his world he still carried a certain weight. Newer members of the organization who had never seen him free grew up hearing that authority still flowed from a man they might only know as a voice on a monitored call or a signature on a letter. Law enforcement reports well into the 2000s and 2010 seconds noted that he was considered by many to be the official boss, even if much of the practical control over day-to-day crimes had shifted to whoever was free and willing to take the risk. The city he once influenced had changed dramatically. Developers worked with new layers of regulations. Many unions had internal reforms and oversight. Technology transformed communications, making old-style code words less secure in a world of digital surveillance. For a man whose career had been built on face-to-face meetings in smoky rooms and payphones on corners, this new era might as well have been another planet. Yet the consequences of his choices continued to ripple outward. Court transcripts, victim statements, and press reports from the time show the lingering impact on small business owners pressured into paying, workers whose pensions were looted through corrupt deals, families who lost relatives to underworld violence, and neighborhoods that had lived for years under a quiet cloud of fear. From a narrow bed in a distant penitentiary, he could no longer walk the streets or step onto construction sites with an entourage, but the city still bore traces of his tenure. The next chapters of his life would be written almost entirely behind bars, as years turned into decades and the last generation that had known the older, more secretive underworld slowly faded away. By the early 2000s, the man who had once stepped onto construction sites with foremen scrambling to greet him now woke up to the same sound every morning. Keys in metal, the bark of a guard shouting, "Count!" The shuffle of feet as men sat up on narrow bunks so they could be seen through the slot in the door. In that world, days looked similar. A bell, a door, a line for chow, a few hours in a yard ringed with fences and cameras. Yet even in that repetitive setting, news from outside still filtered in. Televisions in the common room showed headlines: markets rising and falling, wars starting, towers in Manhattan collapsing on a September morning. Younger inmates argued about music, sports, politics. Vic mostly watched in silence, registering how far the city he once knew had drifted from the streets that had shaped him. He was now an older man in a place where age didn't buy mercy. Medical checks replaced some of the swagger of earlier years. Blood pressure cuffs, routine exams, the slow realization that the body that had carried him through decades of stress no longer answered as quickly as his mind. Still, whenever anyone from his world walked into that facility, they knew immediately who he was. A nod, a greeting, a certain deference still followed him through corridors and into the yard. Outside, people argued about whether a boss locked up for life could really remain in command. Law enforcement reports, informant statements, and recorded conversations said that, in his case, the answer was yes. Visitors sat across from him in plastic chairs in crowded visiting rooms, separated sometimes by glass, sometimes by tables watched closely by guards. They spoke in low voices, aware that microphones might be close enough to catch stray words. Straight talk about crime was off limits, at least in open terms. Instead, they used habits from the old days. Half sentences, references that only someone raised in that life would understand. Names were rarely said plainly. Questions came dressed as casual comments. "How's our friend doing in the Bronx? That thing with the trucks? Is it straight now?" Enough was implied that, by the time a visitor left, they carried with them a sense of what the imprisoned boss wanted. Messages reached key figures on the street. For years, the understanding among many Lucchese members was simple. Whatever titles men carried in New York, acting boss, street boss, Underboss real authority still rested with the man doing life in federal custody. No major promotion, demotion, or internal discipline felt complete unless it lined up with his preferences. That didn't stop change. After Joseph DeFate agreed to cooperate, a new wave of anxiety swept through the family. Men who had once sat with him at dinners now had to decide how to respond to his testimony. Some argued that the only way forward was to pick up the pieces and concentrate on smaller, quieter money. Others still wanted the big scores: contracts, unions, elaborate frauds. Back in his cell, Vic heard names of those taking on leadership roles. Stephen Crea had already shown he could move money through building trades, especially in the Bronx. Another veteran, Matthew "Matty" Madonna, played a growing part, respected for his long service and calm presence. In scattered reports and future indictments, federal agents would describe panels and ruling groups, small committees of high-ranking members running daily affairs in the boss's absence. Underlying those arrangements sat an expectation that decisions still reflected his will. Cooperating witnesses who later testified in court described how his name came up in conversations about strategy. When someone received a promotion, they were told it had been cleared with Vic. When someone was shelved, pushed aside quietly, and denied access to rackets, they were told that the man upstate was unhappy with their behavior. This remote control didn't always work smoothly. Years passed. Younger men, who had never once set eyes on him in person, began to fill roles as soldiers and associates. Some knew his story only from older members' tales, and from what they read in books or saw in documentaries. For them, the boss could feel more like a legend than a living person. Even so, tribute still flowed in his direction. Envelopes that started with Shylock collections, gambling profits, or extortion payments were sliced up as they moved upward. A portion for the local crew, a piece for higher captains, and a share reserved for the man federal papers still identified as the official head. Law enforcement pressure did not let up. New investigations in the early 2000s zeroed in on Lucchese influence in construction and organized labor. Prosecutors alleged that the family continued to pressure contractors, steer jobs, and fix bids, sometimes in cooperation with figures from other New York outfits, sometimes on their own. In taped conversations played in court years later, men spoke carefully about taking care of certain companies, or described how a union delegate would understand what needed to be done. Phrases investigators said were disguised instructions for payoffs and pressure. Each new case brought fresh arrests. In 2002, for example, high-profile charges were brought against Crea and others involving extortion of construction firms. Some charges stuck and led to prison time. Others fell apart or resulted in acquittals. But regardless of the outcome, one effect remained constant. Reputations were dented, money lines were disrupted, and trust within the organization took another blow. Inside his housing unit, Vic would hear names read out on the TV news or mentioned in newspapers passed from bunk to bunk. Every time a familiar face appeared in a headline tied to new indictments, he understood that the circle of men who had built the old Lucchese machine was shrinking. Some of the cases in those years reached back into the period when he had been on the street. Prosecutors brought fresh murder charges against former acting bosses and captains, accusing them of carrying out slayings ordered in the late 1980 seconds and early 1990 seconds. Trials described victims ambushed in cars, on sidewalks, or outside businesses, people marked as suspected informants, rivals, or disobedient earners. The government repeatedly argued that these weren't impulsive acts by hot-headed gangsters, but steps in a cold system, one he had helped design and enforce. He was not always named as a defendant in those later homicide cases. He was already serving as many years as the court could give. But the picture painted in courtrooms around New York placed his tenure as boss at the center of a culture where fear was policy, not accident. Over time, one reality became impossible to ignore. The same methods that had once kept crews in line: threats, rumors of deadly consequences, purges of suspected traitors, were driving more people to seek refuge with federal agents. Men who had watched their predecessors vanish or wind up dead after being labeled disloyal began to think differently about their chances. The idea of waiting quietly for the next internal order no longer appealed when witness protection programs and plea deals promised a shot at a new life far from old enemies. In the late 2000s and early 2010 seconds, That trend accelerated. Informants emerged from within the Lucchese ranks and from allied groups in other states. They sat down in interview rooms and filled in gaps that investigators had only guessed at before: how a particular loan-sharking network operated, which social clubs were true headquarters, how profits from construction schemes were divided and laundered. One such insider, John Panisi, would later play a significant role in reshaping public understanding of the family's internal workings. He had been a made member in good standing, attending meetings, paying tribute, and participating in schemes. In the middle of the 2010 seconds, fearing he might be targeted himself, he chose to cooperate. His testimony in later proceedings echoed a familiar theme, that even decades into his sentence, the man sitting in a federal cell remained, at least on paper, the boss. Panisi and others described how messages attributed to Vic still sparked fear. At one point, according to their accounts, rumors spread that he believed certain high-ranking street leaders were holding money back from him or failing to follow orders in a dispute. The story that filtered down to lower levels was that he had lost confidence in them, a phrase everyone in that world understood could be far more dangerous than it sounded. Some claimed he had even quietly approved severe measures against their circle, echoing the drastic steps he had once taken with the New Jersey faction. Whether such a broad order truly existed, or whether it was stretched and repeated by frightened men, is hard to prove from the outside. What matters is that people inside the organization believed it might be real. That belief alone sowed distrust at the top. Meetings grew more tense. Longtime allies began to doubt each other's loyalties. In that atmosphere, choosing to sit down with prosecutors no longer felt like an impossible step for some. It felt like a way to survive. Meanwhile, the world beyond prison fences kept spinning into unfamiliar shapes. Banks tightened their regulations, making old-style cash laundering tricks riskier. Phone calls could be recorded easily. Text messages and emails left trails investigators could trace if they gained access. Cameras appeared on nearly every storefront and street corner. Staying hidden, once a question of picking the right bar or pay phone, now required dodging entire systems. For a man whose career had depended on face-to-face trust and networks of favors, the move to this new kind of surveillance state was jarring, even if he experienced it mostly through secondhand news. Locked away, he heard about wiretaps that no longer required clumsy physical bugs in cars, about analysis tools that could track money movements across continents with a few keystrokes. The old sense that secrets could live forever in the space between two men on a sidewalk no longer held. By the mid-2010 seconds, the Lucchese family had been hit by so many cases that some observers predicted its collapse. Yet investigations kept naming new defendants, younger members, fringe associates, and occasional veterans who had managed to avoid charges for years. Federal complaints described a long list of crimes that looked familiar: sports betting, Shylock loans, extortion of small businesses, influence over certain unions, alongside newer angles such as healthcare billing scams and internetage frauds. In 2017, a large federal action against what prosecutors called the East Coast LCN enterprise swept up figures tied to several mafia families, including the Luccheses. Among those indicted were Matthew Madonna, identified as a street boss, Stephen Crea, described as underboss, and others accused of racketeering, including conspiracy in the killing of a Bronx figure named Michael Meldish in 2013. The case portrayed a group that, despite decades of pressure, still reached for violence when disputes or perceived insults couldn't be settled with words. Trials from that case ended with severe sentences. Madonna and Crea received life terms. Other defendants were also handed long stretches behind bars. For observers, it looked like déjà vu, another wave of top-tier leaders leaving the street in handcuffs, just as had happened in Vic's generation. From his own remote cell, he saw yet another round of men walk the same path he had taken in the early 1990 seconds, from social clubs to arraignment rooms, from local jails to distant penitentiaries. The names were different, the charges updated for a new era, but the basic story remained: a tightly knit group using intimidation and illegal schemes to fill pockets, only to have that world slowly peeled open in front of strangers on a jury. By then he was well into his 70s, later his 80s. Age had reduced some of the edge that had once made him a feared presence in Brooklyn clubs. Health issues common to older prisoners, heart concerns, joint pain, Chronic conditions became more frequent. Stays in medical units grew longer. But one thing did not change. He did not follow his former underboss into the government's witness box. He did not stand in a courtroom as a government witness describing old crimes to help build new cases. Whatever anyone thought of him, whether as a dangerous figure who had harmed countless people, or as a stubborn relic who refused to bend on that single point, he remained fixed. When the system offered deals in exchange for cooperation, he left them on the table. Letters from relatives and old friends came less often as the years went by. Some of the people he had grown up with in Brooklyn had passed away. Others were too frail to travel to visit. Neighborhoods he had once controlled changed hands, then changed again. Filled now with residents who knew his name only from crime shows, if they knew it at all. Still, within organized crime circles and among investigators who had spent careers studying that world, his legacy lingered. Prosecutors talked about the Amuso era as a turning point, a time when internal purges and extreme enforcement sharpened both the family's capacity for fear and the willingness of its members to flip when the law finally caught up. Former associates who testified in the 2000s and 2010 seconds spoke about those years with a mixture of dread and distance, as if describing a storm that had passed but left lasting damage. The cells and corridors he now walked were far removed from the corridors of power he once paced in social clubs, union offices, and city job sites. Yet in a quiet, indirect way, he still cast a shadow over those places. Investigations into construction fraud, union corruption, and long-cold underworld killings kept circling back to decisions made when he was free, when his word could change the fate of entire crews. As decade followed decade behind bars, the story of his life turned from one of immediate criminal influence to one of consequences legal, personal, and cultural. The next stretch of his time in custody would be less about directing new schemes and more about living with a past that could no longer be rewound, while the organization he once led struggled to find a future in a world where the old rules no longer offered much protection. In the last stretch of his life, days no longer felt like steps toward anything. They were simply counted and endured. Morning came early in the federal penitentiary, where he lived out his sentence. Lights snapped on, a guard's voice cut through the dim hallway, and men sat up so they could be seen. He was one of them now, and had been for so long that the outside world sometimes seemed more like something he'd read about than a place he'd once controlled. By the time he reached his late 80s, reports placed him in a high-security federal prison in Pennsylvania, the same state where he'd been caught in that beauty salon years before. He had been moved through different facilities over the decades, as many long-term inmates are sometimes for security reasons, sometimes for medical needs, sometimes simply because the system shifted people around. Wherever he was housed, the terms of his sentence didn't change. Life, plus more years stacked on top. No parole. The man who had once walked onto job sites and union floors, with the quiet assurance of someone whose word could change paychecks and schedules, now walked slowly down prison corridors in state-issued boots, one more older inmate among many. Arthritis stiffened his joints. Medical forms mentioned high blood pressure and other age-related problems. Trips to the infirmary grew more frequent. He was in the age group where any illness could turn serious quickly. Fellow prisoners who knew his history sometimes watched him with a mix of curiosity and distance. To a young man born in the late 1992s or early 2000s, he was less a living figure of power than a thread connecting them to stories their uncles or grandparents told about the old days in New York. They had grown up seeing mobsters portrayed in films and television shows. And now, here sat a man whose real decisions had once shaped neighborhoods. Those who approached him cautiously often found someone quieter than they expected. Accounts from people who shared cell blocks with him spoke of a man who kept his routine. Wake, count, meals, a little time in the yard if the weather cooperated, reading, then lights out. He was not given to speeches about honor codes or war stories about the past. If he spoke about his earlier life at all, it was usually in short fragments and offhand comment about a long-gone Brooklyn corner, a remark that some building on the news had once been part of a job his people had touched. Outside, crime writers and retired investigators were still filling in details of his time at the top. Books about New York's underworld devoted long chapters to the years when he and Anthony Casso had run the Lucchese family. They described the purges, the war with the New Jersey wing, the window contracts, the labor rackets, and the decision to answer internal doubt with lethal orders. Former captains who had long since entered witness protection appeared in documentaries, retelling stories of meetings in dim social clubs and drives to secluded spots where decisions were carried out. In those retellings, his name recurred as a fixed point. Prosecutors used phrases like brutal reign and reign of terror to describe his leadership. Cooperators talked about how scared they had been to even consider disobedience. Defense lawyers from his trials remembered facing a client who refused every suggestion of a deal, choosing instead to challenge the government and absorb whatever sentence came. Law enforcement agencies, in their briefings and internal charts, continued for years to list him as the official head of the Lucchese family. In reality, younger men, Madonna, Crea, others had taken the risks of running the street operations during the 1,990 seconds, 2000s, and 2010 seconds, and many of them had ended up in cells of their own. But tradition matters in that world. The man who takes the oath as top boss is rarely stripped of that status, even when he hasn't walked outside a secure fence since the first George Bush administration. That strange split meant that as late as the 2010 seconds and into the 2020 seconds, newspapers writing about new Lucchese cases still mentioned him as the long-imprisoned leader somewhere in the background. Younger defendants, when recorded on wiretaps, sometimes invoked his name as a way of giving weight to their own roles. Decisions had been okayed by Vic, or the guy upstate knows about this. Whether those claims were always true, or just useful bluffing, his name remained a kind of currency. At the same time, almost everything else connected to his original life faded. The Brooklyn of his youth, crowded tenements, Italian bakeries, corner clubs packed with smoke, had been steadily replaced. Former strongholds were now gentrified blocks with expensive coffee, stroller eye-lined sidewalks, and residents who knew the area only as a fashionable neighborhood. Old-timers occasionally mentioned, over cappuccinos or at family gatherings, that this or that address had once housed a social club where real decisions were made. For most listeners, it was little more than an interesting footnote. The damage from that era was less easily redeveloped away. Long-running court cases over union pension losses and fraudulent contracts showed how deeply hidden skims and fixed bids had eaten into retirement funds and public budgets. Testimony from scared business owners who had finally felt safe enough to speak in open court told the quiet side of what his business decisions had meant. Small restaurants going under because they couldn't afford both rent and kick-ups. Shop owners paying high-interest street loans when banks turned them down, then living in fear as those debts grew. When activists pushed for cleaner unions or for oversight on public construction money, they often pointed back to the rackets of his generation as the reason reforms were needed. In that sense, his story shaped laws and regulations long after he had disappeared into the federal system. Political arguments over how to monitor labor organizations, how to award big city contracts, and how much power racketeering statutes should have all carried echoes of his rule. Yet for him personally, life had narrowed to smaller questions. Which prison doctor would be on shift when his name came up on the appointment list? Whether a storm outside would cancel yard time, whether a relative would be well enough to visit, whether a guard he'd dealt with for years would be moved to a different unit. He had seen a full turnover in the staff around him more than once. Men and women who had been fresh correctional officers when he first arrived at a given facility eventually reached their own retirement age and left. New faces took their place, often younger than his grandchildren would have been. Some knew exactly who he was from background checks and officer chatter. Others had to ask older coworkers, "That guy, why do the inmates treat him with that level of respect?" and heard a short version of his biography. On the legal side, time had taken away nearly every meaningful option. Early in his incarceration, his attorneys filed appeals and post-conviction challenges. As years went on, those efforts thinned. Courts grew increasingly reluctant to reopen old mob cases that had already been affirmed multiple times. Changes in sentencing law that helped some inmates did not reach people in his category, those serving multiple life terms for violent racketeering convictions. Compassionate release, a path sometimes used for inmates with terminal illnesses or extreme age-related decline, rarely applied to people serving life terms for leadership roles in long-running criminal enterprises. Judges, when asked to weigh sympathy against the scope of his record, would have seen not just one case, but an entire trail of findings. Years of underworld control, internal purges, intimidation, and financial harm spread across a city. So he remained where he was, while the story of organized crime in America continued to shift. The old Italian-American families, once unmatched in their reach over certain unions and neighborhoods, now shared space on enforcement priority lists with a host of other groups, cartels from abroad, local gangs, online fraud rings, and more. The kind of lifelong mafia career he had pursued, traveling from street corner errands to full membership to boss, had become rarer and riskier. When younger inmates, curious about stories they'd heard, asked older prisoners or even him directly whether it had been worth it, there was no simple answer available in the record. He never issued a public statement renouncing that life. There were no tearful interviews in which he apologized to victims. Whatever reflections he had about the trade-off power and money in his middle years, exchanged for decades behind fences, stayed locked behind the same steady expression he had worn in court. The contrast between first and last chapters in his life was stark. As a child in 1932, Brooklyn, he had watched well-dressed men stand outside social clubs, controlling the rhythms of the block. As a young associate, he had carried envelopes and enforced debts, learning how fear could be turned into income. As a made man and captain, he had commanded crews, rigged contracts, and sat in smoke-filled rooms where policy for entire neighborhoods was set. As boss, he had approved decisions that meant some people lived and others did not, and he had tried to rule by tightening his grip whenever he sensed defiance. Now, in old age, he lived on a tier where men compared commissary lists, traded paperbacks, and watched clock hands creep. His world, once stretching across boroughs and even states, had compressed to a handful of corridors and fenced yards. As of the most recent public records before this story was told, he was still alive, one of the longest-serving federal inmates from the New York Mafia world, carrying a life sentence imposed in the early 1992s into his late 80s. His continued presence in custody stood as a kind of living archive, a reminder to guards, inmates, lawyers, and investigators that the eras they read about in reports weren't as far away as they sometimes felt. For people studying organized crime, his biography offered a clear arc. It showed how a boy born in a poor Brooklyn neighborhood could, by degrees, be drawn deeper into a criminal culture that rewarded silence and aggression, how that culture could extend its reach into legitimate industries and government contracts, and how modern law enforcement tools, wiretaps, long racketeering cases, and witness protection could finally penetrate that wall of secrecy. For families who had lost relatives to underworld violence, for business owners who had spent nights worrying about whether to pay or resist, for workers whose unions had been quietly twisted away from their true purpose, his name called up something more personal. Years of fear, anger, and frustration. He had set out, like many in his world, believing that the code he lived by, loyalty to the family, refusal to cooperate with authorities, willingness to enforce rules at any cost, would protect him. In the end, that code did not stop the government from building cases, or juries from convicting, or judges from handing down sentences meant to last until death. It did not keep his closest lieutenants from flipping when they feared his wrath more than they trusted his leadership. It did not preserve the old version of the Lucchese family as a stable structure. Instead, it helped fracture it. And so the story settled where it had to. In a cell, with an old man who had once been one of the most feared figures in New York, now subject to the same counts and rules as every other prisoner on the block. Outside the walls, the city moved on. Children played in parks, built on land once scarred by half-finished, mob-tied construction. Office towers whose contracts had once been quietly influenced changed tenants a dozen times over. Former social clubs became storefronts with no memory of backroom meetings. People walked dogs and pushed strollers down streets where union delegates and captains had once argued in low voices. His life had spanned that whole sweep from a Depression-era childhood on cramped Brooklyn streets, through the high tide of mafia influence in the late 20th century, to an old age spent watching a new century unfold from behind bars. The power he'd held, the fear he'd inspired, the plots he'd overseen, all of it, eventually collided with a system that, slowly but steadily, pulled him off those streets and shut a steel door behind him. The door never opened again. The neighborhoods he'd ruled changed faces. The men he'd ruled with died or disappeared into their own sentences or new identities. And his story became something people told others, a cautionary account of how far someone could rise in that world, and how final the fall could be when the bill for all of it finally came due. And so, We close tonight's chapter of the Silent Empires. Victor Amuso here, thanking you for walking with me through the quiet corridors of power, fear, and the cold precision that shaped my reign. If this story helped you unwind or drift towards sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay close for more tales of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the hush of the empire wrap gently around you, and may the echoes of history guide you softly into rest. Good night.